This week on The Futurists, Rob Tercek, Ross Dawson, and Brett King return to the studio.
I still believe that we're going to have very strong employment for a long future. Disruption is going to be really intense, but we're going to get a few just blowout examples of restructuring the economy.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm delighted that my buddy and co-host, Brett King, is back. Brett, it's been months. It's so good to see you finally.
Yeah, it's been a while. And we have another host. Yeah, another host, actually, because Ross is hosting shows. Ross,
it's good to see you. I haven't seen you since September, man. Great to see y'all.
It really feels like The Futurists now, right?
Interesting times.
Holy cow. Since the last time we spoke, the world has gone through a couple of curves. We were just saying before the show that this is going to be a conversation about destabilizing events. And if it's anything, 2026 has had in store for us so many destabilizing events. So today, folks who are listening, you're going to hear us talk about a response to the multiple cascading consequences of two big events. First, the release of a new kind of AI, let's say a new step forward in the artificial intelligence world. Anthropic's Mythos, which has created a tremendous amount of curiosity and excitement, but at the same time, that happened in the context of a global conflict that just emerged out of nowhere, quite surprisingly, without much prior discussion or debate or even any attempt to create political consensus around the idea. The United States and Israel have attacked Iran, and we are now weeks after both of those events, so we're catching up on this, but now it's time for us to talk about consequences. Brett, why don't you give us a little perspective, because you've been bouncing around in both of these worlds recently, so share your view.
Well, I obviously live in the conflict zone, being based at least part-time in Dubai. And certainly the most recent ceasefire has changed the tone of life in Dubai and, brought some respite from the issues there. It is very interesting from the point of view of how this changes the dynamic long term, in terms of whether this requires countries like Saudi and the UAE to be more independent from the United States on a medium-term basis. But certainly also, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, but, the data on the impact of this conflict on oil supply is, I think, a massive change in terms of long-term energy policy, because it's the largest single drop in supply, and this is from OPEC, in history in terms of oil supply. In the oil crisis in the 1970s, we saw approximately a 4% drop in global supply. We've seen a 20% drop in global supply this time around. And wow. I just heard from my good friend, the Fly guy, who runs social media for a lot of the airlines, saying that the EU just has 40 days left of aviation fuel. All right.
Well, one of the nations that depends very heavily on imported liquid natural gas and petroleum is Australia. So let's flip it over to Ross. Tell us what the view from Australia is right now about this needless conflict that nobody asked for.
Well, I suppose there's not at all support for the conflict, but one of the points is of OECD countries, Australia has the least amount of supply. So it was essentially OECD suggested 90-day reserves. Australia has far less than that. And so one of the issues now is to whether we start to see government investment in increasing local oil reserves. There's talk about rationing diesel in particular, where we have a lot of rural trucking. And so diesel is already short, and we're looking at potential for rationing in the country. But I think one of the key points, off your point, Brett, going back to the 70s, is what happened in 74 was that after that, we started to see, of course, drilling in all whole new locations. It changed the dynamics of being able to oil production. But we also saw a massive impact on consumption. So if you go to Japan today, all drivers turn off their petrol engines at stoplights. And that happened in the 1970s. And so what actually happened was we started to see, this ramping up of oil drilling and so on. But for the scenarists who were around at the time, basically we started to see, in fact, this massive drop where there was a drop in consumption of oil because of the change in cost. So supply and demand, whilst of course there's a whole lot of essentially demand which is inelastic for a whole variety of reasons. And of course, one of those is aviation to a significant degree. I mean, pricing starts to change.
Another one is artificial intelligence.
But essentially, we're starting to see, well, how is it? One of the macro responses is going to be, how is it in different ways that we can reduce our dependence on the more and more expensive and less accessible?
You think it's going to reignite that discussion?
Fuels.
You think that it's going to reignite that discussion about conservation and managing the consumption? Because I will tell you, from the United States, that is not the agenda right now.
So I tell you, Ian Bremmer's take on this, and maybe we can add a clip in here. But Ian Bremmer, who I really respect as a political commentator, he said that what it appears to be is that Trump has looked at EV, renewable tech, and seen how China has a lock on rare earth minerals, and his administration is attempting to do the same sort of supply control over oil, and that's why they've taken Venezuela and done Iran at the same time. That seems like a logical explanation.
That's a very realpolitik view of what's going on. It also is a more coherent explanation than any that we've heard from the U.S. administration.
It's very simplistic, but it is
simplistic.
Logic at a very simplistic level.
Yeah.
Considering the source, that's probably appropriate level of intellect.
Yeah. Having said that, even if you say it's cynical, you have to take Ross's position seriously here, which is that there is going to be more and more pressure on self-sovereign nations to have independence from that sort of level of control over oil supply and the risk to the economy. So let's take the example of what Ross talked about in terms of trucking, domestic, national trucking in a country like Australia, where there's sensitivity to this. Well, how do you shift to infrastructure that reduces the impact of long-term oil instability, that looks like it's being telescoped? And electric vehicles and AI automation play into this big time. I think it's quite closely correlated. If you're looking to deploy autonomous capabilities in your economy and get those benefits of scale that AI brings, you're now going to have to be friends with China and get the rare earth metals and the battery and the renewable tech, or you're going to have to be friends with the US. And I think the sustainability issues, the air pollution issues, the climate response issue, all of those things moving forward over the next 20 years, it means that there's going to be more and more pressure to have independence from oil as an energy source.
This is fundamentally a time frame issue. So you mentioned the 20 years, and if you play that, absolutely. But right now, whether it's industry leaders or political leaders, they're not thinking 20 years.
No, I know.
And so I think there is this move. Okay, well, all right, we do need to be thinking about that. But it's like, what do we do immediately to be able to sort of increase electrification, renewables, and so on? Yes, that may be sort of pushed a little bit up the agenda, but it is still in the short term. That's not going to be impacted. But I suppose the point is the degree in which it changes policy now. And that's an open question. I think Rob in our previous conversation was saying, well, some countries, yes, they'll buy it and leap on it. I think, Europe is an obvious case where there's still a strong dependency on gas. Yeah. And, we've already seen in North Europe in particular, the whole rise of renewables is very, very strong. And I think, that will be accelerated unquestionably. But the pace is still always the question.
Yeah, it's hard to deploy it. It's hard to rebuild your grid. It's hard to change your generation capacity from one energy source to another. Back to a point you were making a moment ago, Brett, which is about every country is on its own. I think if there's one message, one consistent message that has come from President Trump, it's that Pax Americana is over and we're no longer the cop on the local beat and you're on your own. And every country now takes them seriously. We saw that happen earlier this year, at the end of last year, in the European Union, where the other NATO countries all clearly came to the conclusion we can't depend on the United States. And I cannot underscore to you enough that here in the United States, there is a conservative party that is done with Europe. Like, they just do not count on Europe. They don't care about Europe. They don't think Europe matters. I hope that there aren't people in the audience in Europe who think I share that view. Of course, I don't. I'm a huge fan of Europe, but I can understand that there is a political party here that just is done with that. Moreover, when it comes to independence, the United States is actually in an interesting position because we are now the largest net exporter of natural gas and oil. So in a way, we're in a position to say we're good. We've got two oceans, one on each side. We've got friendly neighbors, and we've got energy supplies. Good luck to the rest of you. Ross, how does that affect the perception of the United States in Australia? I can't imagine it's doing us any favors.
Because Australia has been very closely aligned historically.
Yes. Again, there's obviously popular opinion and also the nature of what politicians say. So essentially, any polling in Australia, and I think it's aligned with many other countries, is not very positive, let's say, about America generally, and particularly the leadership. But there's still Australia for a very long time, since the 90s, has been managing this balance between its relationship with the U.S. and its relationship with China in particular. It's essentially always been U.S. predominant, and now the defense alliance is really critical. This goes back to the point that it is not nearly as pointed in Australia as in Europe, in this feeling that we have been abandoned by the U.S. There are still many signals which mean that I suppose nobody in Australia says yes, we can depend on the U.S., but it's not the same, anything like the same degree as in Europe, where still. Generally, politically in particular, the balance is towards, U.S. is our primary defense partner, primary economic partner. China has a role to play, but with obviously deep concern around the regional security issues.
Let me offer an idea here. We had Cory Doctorow on the show a few months back, and it was a good conversation. One of the topics that came up is his concept, enshittification. I hate to use that term because it's an ugly term, but it's the term he's been using about all the big internet platforms. He's been saying this for quite some time and now has a book on the subject. It was a good show. I encourage you to check that out on thefuturists.com. But in the meantime, his comment about enshittification is that eventually all platforms do this. They get people locked in, and once you're trapped in that platform, they change the rules of the game in a way that disfavor you and grossly favor the owner of the platform. It appears that Trump's doing that with our international banking system, our international trade, and our defense policies. He's enshittifying American foreign policy, and any country that has a dependency or a long-standing relationship with the United States suddenly finds that we're no longer such a good dance partner. The United States of the past that would often defer its own interests in order to favor the interests of the group that it was with, that's over. Now it's the United States is looking out for itself, and you're on your own. I have to imagine there are an awful lot of leaders around the world who are desperately recalculating not just their defense, but also their supply chains and their country's internal economy dependency on trade with the United States. So that seems to me to be one of the biggest consequences.
Well, I think if we have a geopolitical frame here, I mean, we are moving to a global realignment, which is less, which is more around independence, and so it's less around the essentially the partnerships and trade we've had in the past. But there still are two predominant economies in the world. With the third one rising.
Pick a side. It's pretty clear that
it's not necessarily pick a side, but it is essentially. So China is obviously is trying, particularly in Africa, the whole Silk Road. China is looking to expand its sphere of influence and to be as friendly and supportive and to get into things. America is not taking that role. But we are now seeing that in many domains that there is this, a shift. One of the macro things is the shift to more self-sufficiency. And also, of course, as Canada, as we've seen, Canada sort of proposing a more this mid-tier nations being able to sort of band together in a sort of a new, realignment.
Like a non-aligned movement.
Mark Carney.
Which is where I think that is potentially one of the most interesting ones. Is do you start to see the larger economies outside the top three start to align around a whole array of issues, from trade to security, alignment, and beyond.
I think it's an easy prediction to make that smaller countries can protest as much as they like, and in some respects, it's like college students who protest, and then the professors and the administration can sit back and relax because they know that, the students will march around the quadrangle with their signs today, and tomorrow they'll be back in their seats. And I think with respect to the United States, that's how the U.S. government now sees the rest of the world. They're like, people might not like what we're doing, but tomorrow they're all going to be back in their seats, because where else are they going to go?
Yeah,
seriously,
I think
Australia going to line itself with China?
If Japan and Germany and UK and and France are not small economies.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at if you look at what China has been doing the last 10 years in particular, right? I think China recognized this risk, certainly the risk of sanctions, seeing the sanctions on Russia. So China's investment in an alternative payments rails capability to SWIFT, the international network that the U.S. does have control over in this instance, is a clear signal.
And abuses it constantly, right? The United States abuses its control of the finance system to penalize other countries that it doesn't like. So China's opted out of that. China is, dominating in EVs. They're dominating in renewables. Last year, half of all the renewable, half of all of the solar deployed globally was deployed by China. India is now starting to catch up. The bigger economies, the bigger emerging economies, are starting to retool away from, this sort of from what, the dollar? I mean, come on. You've been talking about this for 3 years, Brett. It's never going to happen.
Yeah, but it is happening, but it's happening slowly because, the dollar dominance has been built up over decades.
An awful lot of reasons to look for an alternative. That I will grant you for sure.
I'm interested in your comments on this, Brett, because I think it is really interesting around not just reserve or default trade currencies, but also the rise of stable coins as well as CBDCs, where stablecoins now have a market cap of around $300 billion, a significant proportion of overall trade. These are essentially USDC.
46 trillion in stablecoin trade last year,
linked. Yeah. But now we are starting to get more and more essentially the Genius Act is default a global standard for stablecoin regulation. But now China is getting in on the act as well. And so I think I'm interested, Brett, on your thoughts around this shift where, we are, as you say, Robert, it's a long way from shifting from US dollar default. We've always say, well, what's the alternative? The rise of stablecoin provides potentially a shift there.
You're not going to run autonomous finance on fiat currency on batch-based payment systems like SWIFT or the ACH system that's in the United States. You can't, right? You need that real-time capability. You need to tokenize it. So at a minimum, it's going to be stable coins plus, and we're talking about different types of value stores and things like that. So there's new infrastructure coming into play in terms of next-generation financial services that does move us away from the U.S. financial infrastructure. To be honest, players like Stripe, which is yes, it's US based, but it's also dominantly Europe in terms of its infrastructure. These players are carving out sort of new infrastructure channels and paths for the financial system that emerges on top of AI. And this is pretty interesting because China's obviously got a big role to play there. They're already starting to do cross-border stuff with CBDCs. I could see the BRIC alliance becoming a platform for cross-border, wholesale CBDC development with China's CBDC as the framework there. We just saw an announcement between the UAE and Philippines about doing a stablecoin corridor for remittances between the UAE and the Philippines. So you're going to see a lot more of this trade-oriented automation for cross-border that's going to move away from the traditional traditional rails because it's not fit for purpose, for autonomous. And, this flies into not the discussion about Claude and Mythos and cybersecurity, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but it flies into the open claw agentic space, agentic payments, which is certainly accelerating very, very rapidly this year. You're not going to be running agentic payments on the old US financial system either.
Where one of the linkage points is programmable money.
Exactly.
Well, so I think it's no coincidence that the Trump administration got the Genius Act through before they started doing all this warmongering. In other words, there may be more reason going on and more rational thinking going on than what we see presented on Twitter or on Truth Social, if you will. The idea there then is that this is well considered in advance, and they wanted to put a structure in place to ensure that the U.S. dollar is backed by some stable currencies, and I think that's how I would interpret the Genius Act. The idea of legitimizing stable coins and crypto in general in the United States, as long as it supports the U.S. as the default currency or the reserve currency. I don't know if it's going to play out like that, but that seems to me fairly obviously in retrospect, that was what the initiative was about.
And for now, it's having that impact.
Let's talk a little bit about the cybersecurity angle. And, we have seen Mythos launch in this space. And, Ross, you and I had a bit of a conversation about this. But the other thing that is sort of the interesting conjunction here is that, it's not that long ago that Anthropic stepped away from, the concept of using their AI for autonomous warfare purposes. Right? And that led them foul of the Pete Hegseth and the Department of War. But there is there is some clear code vulnerabilities emerging from Mythos. And when you start talking about cybersecurity and cyber warfare as another vector, that sort of comes into the risk. We know there's been a lot of cyber attacks associated with the most recent Iran conflict as well. But how do you guys think that plays out in this context? Because where do we go if we don't have security on traditional compute systems?
Well, the macro view is that essentially the model capabilities disseminate at approximately, call it say 6 months from frontier to be able to more broadly disseminate it and brought into the current open source models. So, whatever the time frame. So Mythos is now not available to the public because of the, supposed dangers, and they're giving it to people to be able to patch their systems, or select large organizations. At some point, Mythos will be more broadly available, and the reality is that there are a whole array of vulnerabilities which are going to reside not necessarily so much in the financial institutions or major open source, because a lot of those will be addressed, but across the board. And what is inevitably going to happen, if these capabilities are available now, it is almost impossible to imagine that, within 12 months at the outside, that we have broadly available, quite possibly open source weights, models, similar capabilities for cyber attack. So, now the current action is we're trying to shore up defenses as much as possible in anticipation of that. I think there's a fair chance that large organizations generally will do what's required to be able to repair. This is a bit of a Y2K thing. Y2K was not a big thing because there was a massive amount
because we
preparing for it. If we didn't prepare for it, it could have been really big. Whereas now,
and there wasn't a war going on with a country that has really good hackers on its side.
It's pretty inevitable that Iran has got some
that I don't think
cyber attack capabilities that are keeping in the drawer until they really want to use them. So this basically means we are to I think a couple of both of your earlier points, this world of instability where warfare becomes largely cyber warfare, and these capabilities of cyber attack are very broadly disseminated.
And it's also an asymmetric threat, right? So that I would say Mythos helps tremendously those places, countries, actors, maybe they're not state actors, who didn't have their own cyber warfare team or a very extensive one. Now suddenly it's like a massive boost. Just like AI is a boost for people who aren't very good writers. Suddenly they're mediocre writers. Well, that's better than being a bad writer. There's a whole line of thought here, Ross. I'd be curious to hear what you think about this.
Have you guys seen Alex Karp's manifesto for? He's the CEO of Palantir. Have you seen his 22-point manifesto based on his book?
I haven't read it. I sort of read commentary about it. It does seem fairly, power is everything.
But here's the point is that he's saying that at this point we want to take humans out of the interface for warfare, and it's going to be robotic led and so forth. The conversation about Anthropic in that context with the U.S. Defense Department is very interesting, but it also I mean at a time when war is becoming grossly unpopular. Sort of having a draft in the United States, for example, to support a ground war in Iran would be very, very difficult politically.
Yeah.
But sending robots to do that fighting, that's going to be far more acceptable. So the problem with that is once we go down that path of autonomous warfare, and I guess this is what Anthropic was trying to avoid, we can automate war at scale. And that's one issue. But the other issue is the nature of the potential attack vectors that Mythos has brought out, which is this chaining together of vulnerabilities that we normally wouldn't see used in attack vectors by human hackers.
That's the problem. The superintelligence aspect of it is the problem. It's like you can play that card once, but once you put that in play, we can't stop it, right? As soon as you go with autonomous warfare and you relinquish the decision-making capability to a non-human intelligence, you can't go back from that. And we might not be the people who are the author of that decision. I think that's the takeaway from these.
Did you see the recent study which basically war gamed nuclear war and let AIs and the AIs in many cases basically initiated a nuclear war.
I was going to say one last thing before Brett said that, which is that there's a school of thought here in the United States that says, hey, Anthropic is planning to go public. But Anthropic does not have the stockpile of GPUs that OpenAI has, so they're at a deficit. I notice this as a Claude user, as a heavy user of Anthropic products. I notice they're deprecating my usage. I used to be able to run systems and run multiple agents. Now they're saying, "Oh, you've hit your limit. You got to stop." Yesterday, I had to stop for an hour because I maxed out my plan or whatever. So there are people who are saying that whole thing about Mythos, it's too powerful, we can't release it, we're only going to show it to 40 companies and so on. They're saying, no, these guys don't have the compute power to release it. If they did, that would be a product that would be out right now. But they're trying to frame a narrative around their coming IPO, and so they're trying to position it as we built this superhuman thing.
I think that's valid. I think both are true. I think it's not exclusive.
Right? Well,
but I think that's valid.
But you're going to see a lot more of this, Rob, and I tell you why. Is you can't have I saw actually Ashton Kutcher had some amazing commentary on this the other day. He was at a conference. But look, as an investor in this space, he's been a very strong investor in early tech for a long time now. So, despite his work as an actor, I respect his understanding of this. But he raised some really good points. Is that between now and in terms of where we see in the 2030s the use of AI going, we have to build 200 gigawatts of generation capacity to power just the AI that we're investing in right now. And the U.S. has not invested in energy alternatives to power this. So
70 years out of date.
This is a key problem for Anthropic and OpenAI. This is why the biggest data centers that OpenAI is building are offshore, like the 5 gigawatt Stargate, data center in the UAE.
It's a great topic, but I want you to hold that thought. We got to go to a break because you're opening up a whole new dimension of this conversation. Folks, don't go anywhere. You're listening to The Futurists with Ross Dawson, Brett King, and myself, Rob Tercek. We're going to be back just after this. Hang tight. Hey there, you're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with my co-host Brett King and our buddy Ross Dawson dialing in from Australia. So we've got, Bangkok?
Australia.
Sydney and Los Angeles here today. Multiple perspectives on a polycrisis, the many consequences of instability in the world and a year ahead that looks like it's going to be continuously unstable. Just before the break, I rudely interrupted Brett because he was just about to go off on a jihad on
You're
the topic
always
of
rudely
energy.
interrupting me, bro. That's the nature of the podcast. I'm just kidding.
That's how it works with us. That's exactly it. That's how we roll here. Got to have some sharp elbows to play this game. So anyhow, Brett, you were about to tell us about the energy picture, the energy forecast. I know we're circling around this topic, but let's go into it right now because that is the gating factor on deploying artificial intelligence at scale. The U.S. grid is hopelessly out of date. To upgrade the U.S. grid will take, some people estimate, 40 years for us to bring the grid up to stand. There's no effort underway right now to do so, which means that the data centers that are being built in the United States might have to wait up to 5 years to get connected to the grid, even if there is adequate energy generation or power generation for them to fire that up. So some of these massive investments we've heard about are being put on hold. And also, some of the investment that was coming from the UAE and from other nations in the Middle East is also being put on hold, or subject to review, at least, given the instability in that region right now. So as a result, this race towards launching super intelligent AI at scale seems like it's going to become unpredictable. In the meantime, the Chinese are being very pragmatic by rolling out less energy consumptive AI, open source models that can be run locally. And that's a very destabilizing approach. These American companies, weirdly, we all know that open source is the best way to develop software. And yet every AI company in the United States is focused on building proprietary models and pouring billions of dollars into scaling them. The Chinese might have the better play. What do you all make of that?
Let me jump in, and then maybe we'll get Ross's commentary on this. I think what's really interesting is how investment in AI is sort of reshaping this, because in the US, it's about getting the most valuable AI company, right? And the US can deploy a ton of capital in that respect. China doesn't have the ability to go out and raise $100 million or $200 million or $500 million for AI companies in that same way. And their approach has not been to try and create the world's best AGI. Their approach has been able to try to industrialize AI at an economic scale, have a distributed AI, which is why you need open source. You can't rely on proprietary models in that instance. But at the same time, China has been very aggressively retooling their grid over the last 3 years, right? And they are more advanced in next generation nuclear than the United States. This is,
renewables. They dominate renewables.
Right. The anti-renewables camp in the US is always talking about nuclear, right? But there's no investment in nuclear in the United States either. Whereas in China, you have massive investment in next generation thorium, the first examples of small modular reactors, all of these things, China is leading on. So China is getting ready to industrialize autonomy at scale across their economy. The US doesn't have a strategic plan for this because of big oil and the conflict of that monopoly, versus what they're trying to do. So it's not just lack of coherent policy in the United States in terms of retooling for smart economies, but it's the fact that the US system of lobbying groups and these controls are now coming to sort of restrict the US's capabilities in respect to where they go.
It's true. The future doesn't have a lobbyist, right? But all these entrenched companies have great lobbying firms that spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year to ensure that they're not going to get displaced. One of the things I noticed about the UAE and Saudi Arabia is that they are diversifying away from fossil fuel faster than the United States, which is kind of shocking. But again, from the U.S. perspective, we aren't aware of that. We tend to look at those countries, the Gulf states, as gas stations that allow us to put a military base there. And that's a very myopic perspective. And I think now both of those ideas are being challenged right now because of this war the United States initiated. Whereas those countries are making aggressive efforts to diversify into renewables. They're trying to focus on exporting the fossil fuels, but moving their economies onto being energy independent away from fossil fuel. It's actually quite an extraordinary move, I think, and a bold one. But Ross, we didn't give you a chance to respond to the AI question, so please go for it now.
Well, I mean, just sort of building on both of your points. I think just taking from a AI company perspective. So there is these choices around how much do you invest in your data centers and build, because the costs are in the tens, potentially hundreds of billions, and your forward revenue is unpredictable. So that you are, as they are all, as you said, Rob, betting the company. So OpenAI is kind of saying, it's win or bust. And both are possible, because they're just basically, we're not going to hold back. We're going to assume that it's going to grow massively over time. So Anthropic is taking a little bit more measured approach and saying, all right, we have to map out. We have to have some scenarios around how the revenues are going to play out, how the flow of capital coming into the company is going to play out against our investments in data centers. So if you overinvest, you're dead. If you underinvest, then you don't have the capacity. You're not able to serve people well. As you said, Rob, okay, you're getting unhappy with the models. You got to move on to the next one. So it's a very delicate to get that balance and degree of investment in the underlying infrastructure, which serves your AI capacity. So we don't know. And we have to be mapping scenarios, and all of these CEOs and data center operators and so on who are building all of this, let's aside the electricity for now, I suppose obviously any data center requires the electricity support to it. These mixed infrastructure growth things. So in the long run, one of the big questions is, okay, now currently globally we have 2% of total energy usage is data centers intrinsically, and it's been pretty close to that for a while. So the potential, the IEA forecast more like 3%. So is it more like what Musk thinks, where it will be 10 or 20% of all energy usage is data centers, and we got to stick them in the sky and all of these things? And this is where we do need futurists, truly scenaric thinking around understanding what are the potential pathways, what degree of basically underlying demand which generates revenue, which justifies that investment in the data centers is justified. So essentially OpenAI wants to charge $10,000 a month for usage because then you're replacing a person. And so this is, again, plays out into, what does this jobs play? And the justification for the degree of revenue which supports the extent of data center and energy production build, which all this requires, is predicated on either extraordinary growth in productivity or essentially massive supplantation of human workforce, which again would have negative economic repercussions. So there's many layers to how we have to play out the scenarios.
So I don't know whether you guys saw, but Jerome Powell had to respond to the whole technology unemployment question the other week in questioning on Fed interest rates. And he said, look, there's definitely a correlation. We don't understand quite what the correlation is. And, but it's definitely being used as an excuse when it comes to laying off human workers, whether that's just rationalization, or whatever. But, I've been very hot on this topic for a long time, Rob, and I think we're starting to see early signals that this is going to be part of the economic model for companies like ChatGPT and Anthropic, justifying getting rid of human workers in order to use the AI stack, right?
Yeah. Let me put it bluntly. Everybody's wondering, what's the $4 trillion business problem that this massive investment in AI solves? And the answer to that question is very simple. The $4 trillion problem is wages paid to human workers.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's the simplest
we're
answer.
on the same page.
Productivity growth could answer it, but I mean that's a little more tenuous.
Yeah.
Ross,
when you come.
Go ahead, Brad. I'm sorry.
No, I was just say, when you come to automation at scale for dark factories and stuff like that, then yes. Yeah. But dark factories have the same problem as data centers in terms of energy requirements, right? And so what you are seeing the data centers, in the US having to do now is run gas turbines on site to produce their own electricity so that they're not draining the retail grid. I mean, this is a major chink in the strategy of US not having this energy flexibility on the grid level that China has, for sure.
No political willpower to reinvent the grid or rebuild it. We actually have 3 different grids, and they don't even even connect. It's a mess.
The degree of outages
Ross,
in California and Texas is pretty wild to watch from outside.
Yeah.
You skimmed over a topic that I think is worth circling back to, which is Elon Musk. Now, he is a guy that we have criticized on this show and sometimes praised. He's certainly a controversial figure who deserves both. But here, I think he's being the most visionary of the bunch. He's about to take SpaceX public. He's combined it with XAI. And what he's doing is in his plan, or he's talked about putting data centers in space. Sounds absurd, right? Until you think it through and you go, well, if he's right, the data center is going to continue to consume tremendous amounts of energy. And face it, what is that? That is really just an expression of where humans see the most value for our energy buck, right? And he's like, they're going to get the most value from AI. It's going to continue to consume it at a rate that's unsustainable. We can't produce enough of it on the planet. Whereas in space, you get the energy for free. And if you build a big enough radiator on your satellite, you get the cooling for free as well. Now it's a little bit hard to replace the chips, so there's a challenge. But he has the lift capacity, so he's got a strategic advantage.
And massive reduction in cost to orbit over the last few years with Starship coming online. It's
literally an order of magnitude reduction in cost, right? And another one,
it's going to make it feasible to put stuff in space.
So this comes back to a time
are ahead of us here. We forget that China has already launched a data center in space, and they're already building a competitor to the Starlink program. So, here again,
and the space station is way ahead of the US, so the ISS. So
there was a very interesting article in New York Times today where basically saying Musk is sort of soft pedaling the Mars stuff and talking up more the sort of intermediate stuff like get onto the moon and the obviously the data centers in space. And so the key issue which I had initially in considering the data centers in space was latency, but that does seem as though that can be addressed with sort of some intermediate things in low Earth orbit. But the bigger
Starlink is a great product, by the way.
If we require that degree of data and compute, how long is it going to be until we can justify the cost of doing that? Is it going to be 3 years? Is it going to be 20 years? And that's again, the same argument.
Yeah, but it comes to this point. It is if you need that self-sovereignty AI capability, just like you need self-sovereign energy capability, then you need the infrastructure. And this is, if you can't build the infrastructure in the US because of politics, you have to go orbital, or this is a fairly sound argument. And you've got it's very interesting that the NASA administrator is actually very good friends with Elon. Right, Jared Isaacman, because of the work they've done together at SpaceX. So when you talk about Elon repositioning around the moon program, the lunar program, and data centers in space, this also correlates with the current administration in respect to NASA's governance as well. So you see a bit more of alignment between him and Jared on that front. And to be honest, we are entering a moon race, again between China and the US, and India's a sort of third player in the wheel there. So there, if China gets a base on the moon, then that's a whole new geopolitical thing as well. In the next 10 years, this is entirely possible. We're not talking like JFK's 10-year by the end of this decade pronouncement, but the same sort of pressure could come on space as a geopolitical platform for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
just to clarify, there is an existing agreement from 1968 where nations agreed not to militarize space. But those rules might not apply to a private corporation. And this creates this notion, or introduces this notion of the sovereign corporation. Crazy concept. I know it sounds like a Robert Heinlein science fiction story. Clearly, that's the path that Musk is on, right? He's like, I'm going to be the first in space, and I'll set my own rules up there. The more you look closely at his plan, the more you think, actually, he's put a fair amount of thought into this. And bear in mind, he is the one American entrepreneur who's done more to advance renewable energy than anybody else, actually, probably on the planet. So here he's talking about energy, the best energy solution is to get this from the radiant energy of the sun at no cost to the United States or to our national grid. There's some merit to that thinking. He has applied to the FAA for a license for 1 million more satellites. 1 million. Now, what's interesting is that that LEO orbit is going to be so cluttered with these microsatellites that now people are saying,
space is pretty big, Rob. I don't know. I mean, there is going to be a lot more space junk, and it's going to affect visibility.
It's April of 2026. This year, SpaceX has had to avoid more than 100,000 incidents of collision with their existing satellite arrays. They've managed to do it, but it's just a matter of time before there's a catastrophic consequence there where satellites crash into each other and create what's called the Kessler effect.
Yeah, we've talked about this previously.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, so here it is. It's in the cards. Now, what's interesting about his plan with the data centers is those would go on a higher orbit.
Yeah.
And they would rely on the little CubeSats that are down at LEO. And so if those get destroyed, he'll launch more, I suppose, to replace them. Crazy concept, though, isn't it? We're going to pollute space in order to save energy.
Well, so then the other thing is, you got a space-borne generation of energy, which is now possible with microwave beaming energy, down to the Earth. This could be actually, with the sort of launch costs we've got, could be feasible. We had our good friend Pablos Holman on the show talking about, a startup that's doing exactly this. But China is going to be launching the first solar farm in space as well, right? That's right. This is really this. You have the technology technocracies, that are emerging, the transnationals, as Kim Stanley Robinson calls them in his novels, and you have sort of that is a third layer of this sort of bipolar political world that if you say U.S. and Chinese tech and energy, but you also have to throw in the big technology companies and a player like Elon Musk and Bezos as well, because New Glenn is now operating more reliably, despite the slight failure on the last mission. We do have two very capable launch platforms which are designed to get us back to the moon. Incidentally,
well, I think that that's both of you making, I think, a really, really fundamental point on what is shifting. It used to be nations, large nations, U.S., China, EU, whatever, were ones who were playing the space game. And whilst China will be, more than its own companies will be doing that, it's now, yes, there's going to be companies which are now populating space and, as you say, Rob, playing by their own rules. And that becomes a very different landscape when you're looking at, essentially treaties for space. What happens on the moon? Do you get conflict on the moon between things? I mean, there's plenty of resources there, so you should be able to just
privatized moon.
Space in different places.
Have you guys?
This goes a whole new geopolitical layer where it's not just the politics of nations. It's starting to be, as you say, Robert, these sovereign corporations.
Do you guys watch? Have you watched the series For All Mankind on Apple TV?
No,
I did a couple episodes. Yeah.
Right. But so in I think the third season, there is a company called Helix, which gets deeply involved in Mars exploration, and over time essentially discovers a massive water source on Mars, which sort of changes the dynamic. And Helix becomes an equal partner in the operation of this international base on Mars, with Russia and the US, who've developed as these two competing space nations. This is a very plausible scenario for lunar space with a company
it's a public-private
like
partnership.
SpaceX.
We have those all over the world. A lot of people fail to remember there's about 193 countries, like nations, on the planet, but there are more than 5,000 autonomous business areas or autonomous areas for free trade zones on the planet. So we've been producing those at a prodigious rate, and why wouldn't we continue to do that out in space? China has a great number of these SZEs, so I think they'll have special economic zones in space as well. Public-private partnerships. Okay, so we have a few minutes left here. Ross, you want to give us a forecast for the rest of this year, for just 2020? We're going to make it easy here. It's just the next 6 months, if you can.
Oh, but we've got to go 2030 at least, don't we?
No,
come on, we're futurists.
Come on, with 2030, I can't even tell you what's going to happen next week, Brett.
All right, cool.
Do whatever you want.
Well, I'm a scenaric thinker, and so I guess the one question, we've talked about AI and essentially conflict. Two paths for the conflict in the Middle East. One is that we get to a resolution, and one is we don't. I'll take a punt and say we don't. It's still going.
Wow.
At the end of the year.
That has big, huge implications. Okay. All right. That's okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a prediction, but just saying that's feasible.
Based on the negotiations so far,
we're talking AI, is that we just get a few organizations which just go wildly out of control in their growth rate, and it starts to just shift the whole economic dynamics. And I continue to the point saying that I still believe that we're going to have very strong employment for a long future. Disruption is going to be really intense, but we're going to get a few just blowout examples of restructuring the economy.
Brett, how about you? What do you think is going to happen? You can go out to 2030. Go for it.
No. I mean, it's just how we like to finish the show normally. But I will say that the one thing that I think we're going to hear of is I think we're going to hear this term AGI class LLMs. Right, or AGI class models emerging, and as much for marketing purposes as anything else. But we are seeing a significant improvement in performance, and I think this is going to be an accelerated element of where we see this sort of self-recursive improvement starting to cut in with these models. And at that point, the justification for using these models to replace existing employees. Remember the Sam Altman single-person unicorn example that he uses, which also means that in theory, any billion-dollar company could run on a single employee. That's the message that, companies like OpenAI and Anthropic will be talking about in order to get the returns for their, trillion-dollar valuations that we're seeing right now. So I do think that we're going to see more and more application of AI at that level that's going to, create instability from an employment perspective. On the Gulf situation, unfortunately, I'm with Ross. I don't see an easy way for the US to extricate itself, except I think it's going to become these isolated incidents where, you'll have these flare-ups and so forth. In the meantime, the problem of oil supply is going to be with us for some time, right? So this means that
oil will be $110 a barrel or more.
Yeah, and not only that, but the cost of compute goes up as well because they're running gas turbines to run these data centers, right?
So
because they haven't built the renewable.
China.
The gap between China in terms of dollar per deployment of AI is going to increase significantly, and it's going to give China a strategic advantage there. Plus, they've got the EV infrastructure. Plus, they're going to be pushing out renewables. Plus, they've got autonomous transportation systems and all of that. So you're going to start to see
in the United States trying to resupply the Pentagon with missiles that cost $16 million to shoot down a $60,000 drone. I'm with you on that. Let me offer a couple thoughts, and I'm going to look out at the rest of this year because I really can't forecast this crazy scenario beyond. I think there's a key point coming up, the November elections in the United States. And there's two scenarios there. I mean, what it looks like from the polling is that the opposition to President Trump is going to win, in which case his whole agenda is going to come to a screeching halt, and he's going to be a lame duck, and he'll get very little done. He'll still be able to wage war because that's something Congress can't stop. But it's going to stop a lot of the rest of his agenda. However, there's also the possibility that there'll be some sort of terror incident in the United States, and that could be actual terror from the many adversaries that we have, or it could be a false flag event that looks like a terror event, and that would mean that President Trump can declare a state of emergency. If that happens, all bets are off, folks.
He's a wartime president. That could be like this is the one thing is if the Iran conflict continues, in theory, this could give Trump a third term as a wartime president. It's about the only thing that is allowed in the Constitution, right, to give him a third term.
No,
a wartime president.
He can't have a third term. No, he's done. He can't lawfully have a third term, but he could declare a state of emergency, and then all bets are off.
Yeah,
Let me carry on the other thought. The response to the comments you're making about AI. I'm going to make another prediction, which is that there is a foot race going on right now between large corporations and startup companies. And the question is, can the large corporations retool their business with AI at the center, which is not easy to do? Can they do that faster than the new companies can scale up? And my bet is going to be on the new companies. I think you're going to see a new wave of disruptive companies in almost every industry you can imagine. I've been dealing with large corporations lately.
Seeing
I've
it
been
already.
talking to the HR departments of big Fortune 500 companies, and I can tell you they're far behind on their AI deployment, and they can't find their butt with both hands when it comes to like how do you instruct your employees how to use AI in a constructive fashion. They don't have an answer to that question. Meanwhile, I'm seeing dozens and dozens of new companies get started, not with one founder, but 4, which is kind of extraordinary. So you're going to have $1 billion business that's built by 4 people. I think that's going to happen rather soon.
So growth in military is happening with technology companies. Growth in financial services, it's all of the fastest growing financial services organizations in the world are technology companies. The growth in longevity, next generation drug production, next generation medical robotics, all of that, that's all coming from next generation companies. We are starting to see artificial intelligence is going to create this entirely new layer of infrastructure. It's the next industrial revolution, but it does just mean the incumbents lose their leverage for sure.
Well, let's hope an AI comes that figures out how to manage international politics. Wouldn't that be welcome? It'd certainly do a better job than the clowns that are doing it today.
Well, I mean, I'd love to see AI in the mix from a policy perspective. I think the one thing we see with the
Fuller, basically, that's what he always said: is we're going to be ruled by AI, because it's better than the politicians.
The one positive element of these AI models, Grok excluded, is that they do. It is reversion to the mean, and you have the bell curve of human interest. So you don't get the extremes. You don't get the extreme left and the extreme right views on these models as easily as you get more consensus building. So AI is probably going to lead to more consensus-based policy, in my view.
There's some good research came out.
Unless it hallucinates a termination event for the whole planet. All right, listen, we got to bring it to a close.
On that note,
Ross, what a pleasure to see you. Brett, so much fun to catch up with you after such a while. Lively conversation. Folks, you've been listening to The Futurists with our guest, Ross Dawson, with Brett King, my co-host, and myself, Rob Tercek. Every week, we try to bring you people who are thinking about the future in provocative and fun ways, and hopefully we did some of that today. We'll be back next week with another person who's focused on the future, and until then, we will see you in
the
future.
future.